right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of the Albemarle for today's History for Lunch presentation. We're excited for y'all to join us both here in person and on Zoom. If y'all are on Zoom, we just ask that you please mute your microphone and use the chat for your questions. For those of y'all in the auditorium, we ask that you please silence your cell phones, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture for everyone. Now, a reminder, the next History for Lunch is scheduled for Wednesday, September 4th at noon. Lee Holder, who is a regional director with the North Carolina Holocaust Council, will tell the story of Gisela Abramson through her eyes. She moved to Raleigh in the 1970s and was a co-founder of the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. So we hope that you will join us for that lecture again on September the 4th. Now, today we welcome Chris Barber. She will provide insight into the complications of enforcing prohibition in the Albemarle region. Her new book, which is When Ghosts Made Moonshine, is available for sale out in the museum shop, and we'll have a book signing after the lecture if you all are interested. So please join us in welcoming Ms. Barber. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah, and thanks to all of you for joining us today on Zoom or here in the auditorium. It's good to see everybody, and I appreciate your interest. Today, we're going to talk about my book, and I will tell you honestly that before I started doing the research, my impression of Prohibition was more about big city Chicago, gangsters, Al Capone, and Elliot Ness, and it was from television, and I never paid that much attention to it. But several years ago, my husband, who does a lot of research on the history of the timber industry in this area, spends a lot of time at the public library in the history room here in Elizabeth City, at the Outer Banks History Center, and Norfolk's library at their history center. And he does newspaper research. Well, something caught his eye, not just timber, but prohibition. Eventually, he started collecting files for that too. And then one day he presented me with a stack of files and he said, I'm really kind of busy with what I'm doing. Why don't you take a look at this and see if you'd like to write the book? So I did. And so that's how this book came to be. In a way, it was an accident. So my familiarity with Prohibition is limited to that. It was 1920 to 1933. It was a century ago. So I hope that I can provide for you today a hint of what it must have been like in and around Elizabeth City and in the region. Today, I'm really going to focus on two parts, Elizabeth City and East Lake. As you might guess, we do have some ghosts in the story, and they're going to come from East Lake. So I'm going to focus on that primarily today. The path to Prohibition really began with women about 1840 who had had enough. They were tired of their husbands drinking up their wages, leaving them in poverty and destitute. The wives were tired of trying to feed their children. And so from those complaints, it grew into a social welfare temperance movement, which lasted roughly from the 1840s till 1917, when finally there was going to be some action taken. In 1893, the Anti-Saloon League was established, and you can tell from this picture what they were all about: bars, bottles, and barrels. And these ladies, think about it, what we look at today when people protest, and this was a protest. These ladies went in armed with axes and hatchets, and they did destroy anything that contained liquor. So that was their stance. In 1908, North Carolina already passed its own prohibition law. So that was in the books, but it was only statewide, and people still continue to make moonshine anyhow, or any kind of liquor. And what we have to realize is that from the earliest days of settlement in North Carolina, people made all kinds of beverages, alcoholic beverages. They made small beer, which their children could drink. They made regular beer, they made wine, brandy, and other spirits. So they knew how to do this because it was just something they did. And back in the early days, people really didn't drink that much water because, as we know, there's bacteria and other problems in water. So alcoholic beverages were quite common. In the 18th Amendment, which is the Prohibition Amendment, it was proposed by the Senate in 1917, ratified in 1919, and effective on January 17th, 1920. Basically, what Prohibition did is it said you can't make alcoholic beverages, you can't sell them and you can't transport them. So that was what the law said. Now, they had not thought about enforcement, and they passed another law called the Volstead Act, and that was the arm of the law that said we are going to provide enforcement of the law to make sure that people don't do any of the things that the amendment prohibits. Well, as it was alluded to in the introduction, enforcement was really a big troublesome thing because nobody counted on the fact that even though there was a group of people who said, we don't want liquor, we want to prohibit it, there was almost an equally sized group, probably, that said, we just want to drink. And so you had those two groups of people. The people who were for prohibition were called the dries. The people who were wanting to drink or eventually wanting to make alcoholic beverages were the wets. So we had those two groups of people. And actually, there were in-betweeners. The in-betweeners were people who, on the surface of things, supported the dries, but behind the scenes, they drank. And you'll see that there's a milk bottle here in front, and you can come up afterwards and take a look at these things. There was a judge in Elizabeth City. He was a judge. He sentenced people to prison or to time on the road. And guess what he did? He had his liquor delivered to him in a milk bottle painted white. It was set on his stoop, just like everybody else's milk bottle. And that's how he got his liquor. So he was on one side of the law and he was also drinking. So there were in-betweeners. It was obviously a complicated situation. I like this picture. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. That is a pretty dour looking group. But they were determined and they did get the amendment passed. And of course, just a sideline, the next amendment, the 19th, that was passed just after Prohibition, gave women the right to vote. So all that power that was born from the 1840s and the struggle of women resulted in two amendments, but I'm not going to say anything else about that. 1920 was the year of a perfect storm. Prohibition began January 17th, and we had a depression. The depression was not nearly as bad as the one with the stock market crash in 29, but it was bad enough that when soldiers came home from World War I, they needed jobs, and there were not many jobs. The economy was declining in and around Elizabeth City and in our region. Timber had become the prominent economic booster. Well, even some of those timber companies were nearing the end, or they were shutting down, or they were slowing down. So there were not as many jobs. So it really hit hard in our region because of that. Except, depending on how you look at it, it might have been fortuitous. Let's look at the region. I don't know how many of you are familiar with northeastern North Carolina and our Albemarle region, but I want to say that geography is really important to this story. If you look at the top of the map, you see that white band, or that neutral band, that is Virginia. That's the state line and everything above it. But roughly, when we look at the counties, most of the counties in our region are arrayed around the Albemarle Sound. Have all of you been to or across the Albemarle Sound? Most everybody, not everybody, but it's pretty close to here. I guess it's about 40 miles on the way to Edenton, except you turn left before you get all the way to Edenton, and then you'll eventually cross the Albemarle Sound Bridge. But that's why we're called the Albemarle region. And we have Currituck County starting from the east, Camden County, Pasquotank County, Perquimans County, Chowan County, winding around to the south shore. We're looking at Washington County and Terrell County, and again, another part of Dare County. And then there are a few other counties. Hertford County, Gates County, Northampton County, and Hyde County are all part of this region. Now, if you look at things, I want to point out Dare County. If you look below the Albemarle Sound to that green area, pale green, and it says Dare, that is the Dare County mainland. It was over 155,000 acres of swamp forest. That place is going to feature largely in this story. You see that there's some green to the right along the ocean. That's the rest of Dare County. If you've been to the beach, to Nag's Head, you've been there. If you have gone by way of if you've gone south by way of Washington County, Terrell County, into Dare County, you've driven right through it. And that's the back way, our way to get there. You get to Manteo first and you keep going and you get to the beach. But what's important is the Dare County mainland is below the Sound and East Lake is there. And just above it, if you look to Pasquotank County, there's the Pasquotank River. And just above that, about 45 miles north, is Norfolk, Virginia. After the Civil War, we had a post-Civil War timber boom that contrived to really make Elizabeth City kind of the hub of things. And a lot of goods went to Elizabeth City by boat, and then they went north to Norfolk, which is our gateway to the Atlantic trade. Well, all that history was important because once the timber industry was in a decline, we were about to land on the moonshine industry. And those old trade routes mattered because they were still going to use them. They were well established, people had connections, and it was going to be really important. I want to look at Elizabeth City for a few minutes. As I said, I'm going to be talking mostly about Elizabeth City and the Dare County mainland today. And we are just several hundred yards from the waterfront. And that waterfront was important. It was very different then. In addition to some of the lumber mill docks, because there were at least 6 or 7 lumber mills headquartered here in Elizabeth City, there was the Globe Fish Market. People who caught fish, and the fish came by boat from throughout the region, went to Elizabeth City, packed and went north, frozen and packed and went north. We also had a big grocery store that way, not too far from here, that was on the water. That was convenient because once people started making moonshine, you know what they needed? They needed sugar, lots and lots and lots of sugar. They needed yeast. They needed rye if they were going to make rye whiskey, or they needed cornmeal. And then they also needed jugs. If any of you see this, it's encased here. That is a 5-gallon demijohn or carboy. Well, those carboys came by the boxcar load to Elizabeth City, $1 a piece. And some of the moonshiners, particularly at East Lake, bought them and hauled them over across the Albemarle Sound and into the mouth of the Alligator River down there for that purpose. And there was also a hardware store downtown in Water Street. So those were things that people who were in the moonshine trade were going to need. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't stores in some of the other communities around here, but the other communities, whether it was Hertford or Edenton, were smaller. They had some stores, but they may not have had the access that they had right here on the water, just outside of Norfolk, for a lot of goods. There was one other thing that was on our waterfront here: spies. When we think about moonshining, we're talking about 3 groups of people. The first group are moonshiners. They are the people who make liquor. They're the people who are sending folks to Elizabeth City to buy supplies. They take those supplies back to wherever they're making it, all over the region. And so those are the moonshiners, so they can make liquor. The second group is bootleggers. Those are the people who haul it. So they go to wherever the stills are when the loads are ready and they haul it away. And the third group is spies. Well, people who are doing an underground business have to be canny. They have to know what's going on in the area. And once we get to 1920, by the summer of 1920, we do have federal agents who are starting to come and work in the region. They had a hard time getting started, but they did start then. Well, they were pretty recognizable, but people on the waterfront especially, or just hanging around in Elizabeth City, would notice if there was something unusual or if there's somebody they suspected might have been a federal agent. And if they ever went to the waterfront, maybe to get in a boat and head out, they kind of knew where they were going. They were probably going to East Lake. So spies were really important. There's one other group I don't have here, but I will mention: informants. Because just like those in-betweeners who were dry, kind of, there were people who were spies, kind of, but sometimes they switched sides and they were informants for the federal agents. Elizabeth City had an area known as the Bowery. The Bowery is kind of the gritty, hard scrabble working area of any town. I think most old towns have them. And it was a block over from Main Street. Originally, it was called East Matthews Street. Any of you familiar with Elizabeth City? It is now Colonial Avenue. My dentist is on that avenue. And so that area had livery stables, at least two, because the 1920s were a transition period. People were starting to buy cars and drive them, but everybody didn't have them. And so as a consequence, they still needed somebody, farriers for horseshoes and things like that. They still needed some of that old stuff, but it was a transition time. So there were two livery stables in that area. And around the corner on Poindexter Street, there was a Chinese laundry, a pool hall, and some liquor connections. And one of the liquor connections was James Barkley. He was a blacksmith at one of the livery stables. And if you do get the book, you'll read about him and his sons because they were very active in the moonshine trade. The downtown business district, if you've been down Main Street, Elizabeth City, it is still such an attractive area. And it had, in the early 20th century, some grand buildings, some buildings that started as lumber company offices. The Kramer building had offices upstairs, and on the ground floor, there was a department store. So people could come shop and saunter through town. It was a very attractive town, one block over from the Bowery. But the important building to me in downtown Elizabeth City is the federal courthouse. It is a grand building, and it illustrates to me the importance of Elizabeth City a century ago. We have been dwarfed by our neighbors in the middle of the state, and we're kind of small. It's a small region. But at the time when the first Prohibition administrator came to headquarters here in Elizabeth City, his office was in that building. And guess what else was in that building? In a vault, there were 20 cases of medicinal whiskey. We don't think about whiskey as being medicinal, maybe unless you're trying to go to sleep. But in those days, prior to all the medical advancements we have now, it was used for diabetes, even flu. So sometimes people were going to need medicinal whiskey. Well, you see also to the bottom left that there is a prescription form. So they had prescription forms, but the problem was that if you wanted the whiskey for distribution to a patient, you had to have a permit and you had to connect to the official here, Mr. Tuttle, in Elizabeth City in order to request that. That meant that druggists and doctors had to send to this office to request medicinal whiskey from as far away as Raleigh. Now, to me, that says a lot because I would think that Raleigh would have their own. But a century ago, I think we'd have to really look at the situation and see that we were still kind of on an even keel. So it was different then. But if you wanted to prescribe it and have access to it, you had to request it from Elizabeth City. And that, to me, is so important. The other thing that's important is the train, because the train station, or the first train that came through to Elizabeth City, came in 1881, and it connected us to Norfolk. I've already alluded to Norfolk because that is our gateway to the Atlantic trade. So early on, the train station was an important link. The first train station was on the other side or somewhere near Mid-Atlantic Christian University beyond the bridge to Camden County. So there was a train station there, and it served some of the timber or lumber yards there. So there was an industrial complex to that too. I'm sure they also had passengers, but in 1914, they built the train station, and it is at the other end of Main Street on Hughes Boulevard. So if you head out that way, go up Main Street, which has beautiful homes, old homes of all different eras, and you get to the end, I think in about a mile, you get to the light and you look catty-corner to the left, and there is the train station. About 20 years ago or so, somebody opened it as a restaurant. It's empty now. But the important thing I want you to know about it is that I have a postcard up there, top left, and then these other two are photographs that I took. They're all pretty much the same view, but the postcard has jitneys and jitney drivers. Do you know what jitneys were? They were the taxis of the day. And so you see those men are kind of leaning over. I kind of imagine they've got a rag they pulled out of their pocket or a cloth and they're polishing things up because they're waiting for the passengers to arrive. And then they'll take them wherever they need to go. Do they need to come just to downtown Elizabeth City? Are they businessmen coming to a lumber company? Are they family members that need to go over to Hertford? Whatever it is, these jitney drivers were your men. And as you can imagine, they were probably the people in town who knew the most about what was really going on. Do you know what I'm saying? Because they were the first people that newcomers saw, and they were probably pretty observant people. They were in a position to know a lot of things. And there are several places in the book where jitney drivers do seem to be prominent, and one of them even becomes a bootlegger on his own. But this is where it starts at the train station. So in addition, though, after 1920, there are other people riding the trains because in the beginning of Prohibition, they did not give the federal agents in our state cars. You had to come by train and hitch a ride in a jitney and get to town and be ready to go. So they were largely on foot when they were here. So the jitney drivers also probably knew how to size people up because when the federal agents came, some of them may have had sidearms tucked in. Maybe they had baggage that hid long guns. So they came equipped. So they were probably pretty easy to spot. And actually, once they got here, they were not so secretive. So, but that is one of the gateways into Elizabeth City that I think was important. Now I want to take you to East Lake, and we're going to look at this map. And if you can remember for a minute, you see where the Albemarle Sound is, and just imagine that previous map and you're looking north, north, north until you get to the mouth of the Pasquotank River. And then you turn in there and you head up to Elizabeth City several miles. So this is the Albemarle Sound, the Alligator River. And I want to discriminate about East Lake. There is East Lake, which is a lake, and it is nearer to the community known as Machos or Machos. And that is to the center of the picture. But that area closer right on the Alligator River where you see Kinner's Wharf and all those words around there, those place names, that is the East Lake that most people think of. So when we talk about East Lake, I'm not talking about the lake. I'm really talking about the land between the South Lake and Milltail Creek and a few of those lakes. We've got South Lake, we've got Sawyer Lake, and there's even Laurel Bay Lake that took a while for anybody to discover. They made moonshine up there, but nobody could find it. And finally, after several years of trying, they found it. And it's still there, but it's almost like a little ditch to get there. So you can kayak up there, but it was pretty inaccessible and hidden for a while. But water was important because once you got all of your supplies, were you going to haul it deep into this 155,000 acres, or were you going to haul it by boat and try to find a location accessible so that you didn't have to haul it for miles and miles? And so the lakes and Milltail Creek were all instrumental. They were good places for people to make liquor. And this place was also a good place to disappear and escape because the only way to reach it, especially on the western side on the Alligator River, the northern and the eastern side, was by boat. Imagine living in a place where it was hard for people to get to you. They had to really work. They had to take a boat to get there. That gave them, the moonshiners in East Lake, great opportunity because they were pretty inaccessible. They could operate pretty well. And unless somebody was at Kinner's Wharf watching, or the spies were coming across in fast gas boats saying, hey, watch out, they're coming. Life was pretty simple and plain. So this was an important thing to get in mind. I do want to point out there are several communities. There's the Lake neighborhood. There is East Lake. And I think when you drive through there, when you cross the bridge from Terrell County into Dare County, you're actually driving through East Lake today. There was also the Twyford neighborhood, Creek neighborhood, the Sandy Ridge area. Sandy Ridge was really where the Black people who lived there lived. They were segregated. And Buffalo City. Buffalo City was the big place there. Now, you've seen Elizabeth City, you know it has a lot of amenities, and Elizabeth City had a hospital. I mean, it had a lot of great things. We're going to go to Buffalo City. Buffalo City was built out of scrap lumber from the lumber industry. Now, from 1880 to 1920, it was a booming place, but people did not live in elegant places. They had dirt tracks for roads. Some of them were pole roads built over sawdust because it's so wet there. But you see a railroad track down the middle. That is a narrow gauge railroad that was used during the lumber days. And guess what? It was still useful during Prohibition. It was a whole lot easier to haul some of your goods from Milltail Creek at that landing, put it on the railroad, and bring it to wherever you wanted to go. The buildings on the right are just dwellings. There were a lot of them. I forget if it was 30 or 40. I forget the number now, but people lived there. During the heyday of the lumber days, there were well over 1,000 people who lived there. But the estimate is that once Prohibition began, a lot of people left. There were not enough jobs. So maybe it was down to 300 people. The other part of the population, sometimes people, men, took the train out into the woods places, and there were camps, and they had bunkhouses during the logging days. Well, guess what happened during the Prohibition days? Those bunkhouses were still useful. The building on the left on this picture is the store, and the picture here is the Dare Forest store, so we know that predates 1920. But once that ended, the Duval brothers who lived there, they took over the store and ran it. And those were the days, ladies, when you carried a basket with you and maybe a glass jar if you wanted some molasses, and they would get it out of a barrel and you'd put it in there, and then you'd get maybe a bag of rice or a sack of rice or whatever. And that's how you shopped for the essentials. People had little gardens and things like that, but it was a pretty plain place to live. They didn't have that big grocery store that they had in Elizabeth City. They also had a hotel called the Red Onion Hotel. I would have loved to have seen it. There's no picture of it that I could find. So now we need to think. I've alluded to it already, but we're getting primed. We've got these two communities. We've got other communities west of Elizabeth City and west of Eastlake, but we know we've got to get north once we start making moonshine. And I will say, I don't know how much moonshine from the rest of the region went north because there's no figures. There was not a lot of ability for people to enforce Prohibition. So there could be all kinds of liquor that went north. And if you were at Edenton, you might have just gone up the Chowan River to deliver it. That didn't make the newspaper. And this book is all about newspaper articles. What people read a century ago is what I use to tell the story. So we're going to see how you went north. If you were at Edenton, western end of the Albemarle Sound, you traveled up the sound to the mouth of the Pasquotank River, and you went above past Elizabeth City towards South Mills, where there are the locks, which then connect you to the Dismal Swamp Canal. And that goes all the way to the state line, and beyond the state line. And along that canal, some of us call it the Canal Bank. When you're going to Norfolk, we're going by way of the Canal Bank. It is really George Washington Highway. So that was one way to go north. Now, if you were at Eastlake and you just wanted to cross the sound, that was easy to follow. But there was an alternate route. And that alternate route is going to be important in what I'm going to tell you about today. And that went up through Currituck County. And so you went by boat up to a little place called Cowanjock. Anybody been there? Okay, that was an important place. Go to that bridge and look at it with fresh eyes, because at Cowanjock, you either went through the canal into the Currituck Sound and north into the river towards Virginia, and then eventually you get to Great Bridge, where it's another canal, and then it opens into the Elizabeth River, and then you're back up to Norfolk again. Or you went as far as Cowanjock by boat, and there would be cars waiting for you, and you would offload your moonshine there, and then they would take off and you would return to wherever you came from. A lot of times you came from Eastlake. So these were the main routes by automobile and waterways to Norfolk. And Norfolk was important because the amount of liquor they actually made in this area and at Eastlake was so much, the region couldn't have supported that. It had to go to big buyers. And incidentally, these big buyers especially for East Lake liquor, extended as far as Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and New York City. So it had a huge reach. It was not a local brew that only local people knew about. I want to talk about automobiles for just a bit because there are not many articles about automobiles that I could find. Remember, it's a transition time. Roads are being improved, but really slowly. It's still kind of a commitment. Nobody knew how it was going to go. But in 1925, in July, the Virginians decided that they were going to pave the road from the state line up towards Deep Creek. It was about 4 miles of pavement. Now imagine if you've taken that road, everybody taken that road? A lot of people have. You know, it's a long stretch and it's short. It feels shorter now because it's divided. But I remember the days, was it 30 years ago when it was a 2-lane road that you went through and the canal was right there beside you. Well, when they improved that little section of road, 4 miles, it cut the travel time between Elizabeth City and Norfolk by 2 hours. 4 miles. It improved it by 2 hours. Now, if you were a bootlegger, would you be scratching your head? I would, because it's like, okay, once I get past Elizabeth City, again, go back 100 years with me, what is beyond Elizabeth City? Today it sprawls out for a great distance, but then there were a few crossroads here and there was a little spot at South Mills. But if you got past the law in Elizabeth City, chances were you were home free. So once you got there and you had this bumpy ride through the back road going up to Norfolk, it was a real gift to get that 2-hour boost in travel time. So what happened that 2 months later, some bootleggers got the idea and the sheriff of Camden County heard about it and he sent for 2 agents. He says, I've got word that somebody's going to be heading north carrying liquor down George Washington Highway. So they all loaded up in a vehicle kind of like this old Ford and they were trucking along as fast as they could. You know, these bumpy roads aren't that great. And all of a sudden, they realized there was somebody coming up from behind. And they came up from behind really fast. It was one of these Chryslers. And the guy came up and he rammed him and knocked him into a ditch 8 feet down, knocked him down. And so when the guys went down, the car was damaged pretty much. But the 3 men crawled out, managed to crawl up the ditch bank in time to see those 2 taillights disappearing, heading towards the state line. So that is an example of what people would do because the sheriff thought that guy owned the load of liquor and he did not want us to get in the way. But how did he know? You see, how did the sheriff know? Some informant told him. How did this guy know? Somebody else told the guy, hey, they're getting ready to chase your load of liquor. So there was a network of people, and it was small, and a lot of people really knew each other. So that is the one story I wanted to tell you about, but I wanted to say one other thing. There was something else waiting for people on the state line. If you managed to get through Elizabeth City and you got to the state line, there was a welcoming committee. Norfolk policemen. And guess what? They weren't there to arrest you. They were there to take a toll. Okay? And the toll was some liquor because they could drink it, sell it, share it, whatever they wanted to. It was money. And so once you got to the state line, the bootleggers knew they were home free because all they had to do was make a little payoff and keep on going because there was a lot of corruption among some of those policemen. In fact, the city of Norfolk administrator knew that and tried to get a handle on that. That's mentioned in the book too, because it connects back to us to Camden County. But that is the extent of what I want to talk about for car travel. The real thing was bootlegging on the water. Remember, we're a land that's half land, half water. The Albemarle Sound was the superhighway of the day since the beginning of people settling here in the late 17th century. So all the rivers and streams and everything else were the highways of the day. And so if you had a small boat and you had a load of liquor, you adapted something called a catfish line. Anybody ever used one? Okay. A catfish line was originally used to catch catfish because catfish are bottom feeders. So what you do is you space out your hooks on a line, you bait them, and you might have a long line, I don't know, 8 or 10 hooks. I don't have any idea. But then you would weight it and drop it to the bottom of a river or stream. And you would come back the next day. Now, the catfish, if they were hooked, weren't going to be dead. They could survive probably. And so you'd have fresh catfish to take off the hook and go. You had some food. Well, you can tell what this is. This is not a catfish line. It is a catfish line, but those are not catfish. Those are the 5-gallon demijohn jugs that somebody, a bootlegger, has picked up from a moonshiner and has a preordained dropping off spot so that the next guy would come later. You know, they did this always. You know, they call it moonshine for a reason. They did it at night. You didn't do it in broad daylight, but you made a drop, eased those jugs down off of the boat into the bottom, and then maybe the next night or before dawn, somebody else would come along with a grappling hook to snag the line. They'd have to drop it very gently, try to search for the line, pick it up, and pick up the load of liquor and go to the next stop. And here's a picture of a demijohn, so you can see that. You can come up later and look at that one. And there's a grappling hook, and that's a wide-mouthed quart jar beside it. So you see it's pretty long, and it's got a loop, so you put a rope on it so you could fish for that line. So small operators who had smaller loads, that's what they did. But there were bigger boats, much bigger boats that carried moonshine. And I'm going to tell you a wandering tale. I say that on purpose because you're going to see we're going to wander. And it's about bootlegging on large vessels, but you have to wait to the punchline because that large vessel takes a while to show up. There was a man named Durant Simmons. He was from Eastlake. He was apparently married and had a family, and that was where he was. That's where he lived. But the people from Eastlake permeated this area a lot. So it was not unusual for Eastlake men to show up here, there, and everywhere, except Durant Simmons showed up on a boat at Edenton Bay. Do you know where Edenton Bay is? Okay. And he's in a boat, apparently with loads of liquor. He's bootlegging it that day. And he sees in the distance another boat coming towards him with what he presumes is federal agents. Now, I'll tell you the secret. The secret is if you were in a boat with liquor, do you know what you tried to do first? You threw it overboard, because if they caught you with the liquor, with the moonshine, they could arrest you with evidence. If you threw it all over the side before they caught you, you were in good shape. That's what one would think he did. But no, he pulled up his gun and he fired. Well, you know they returned fire. And suddenly, apparently, he was overboard in the Albemarle Sound, just off Edenton Bay, February the 2nd. Now, if any of you know about the Albemarle Sound or any of these bodies of water, if you have a choice about it, you're not going in February, but he did. And so what happened? The alleged rum runner dies in desperate fight with dry agents near Edenton. So apparently Durant Simmons is dead. Now remember, this is a book written about newspaper articles, or written from newspaper articles, because there weren't many ways to communicate then. That was the one common thing that people could do. They could read the newspaper and see what was going on. Very few households had radios, and radio at the time only did entertainment, different kinds of programming. They didn't do news radio information for several more decades. They didn't have the internet where everything is instant. They just had that, and they had gossip. Now, you could gossip on the phone. Everybody didn't have one, but sometimes you met somebody on the street and told them something. And so gossip overtook the newspaper that day. It reached Elizabeth City, and it got to a place called Maywood Winslow's filling station. The old picture on the left is not that station. It's a generic one. But I did take 2 pictures of Muddy's coffee shop. Anybody been there? Okay. Don't they kind of look alike? Can you see the resemblance? Probably they were standard, because as cars were becoming more popular, suddenly you needed filling stations. And guys hang out at filling stations. And Maywood Winslow Station was on West Main Street. Well, East Main Street is right across the street. He's on the corner of West Main and uh, Road Street. So I have a feeling it probably was that place, but I can't prove it. But anyhow, in that station, there was a man named John Jack Colson. Colson was at the time from Durant's Neck in Clemens County, and he was known to be engaged in the liquor industry. So he was no stranger to that. And of course, I'm sure people everywhere, jitney drivers and other people, they knew who was who when they were in town. But he was in that station and he was on the phone talking to somebody, and he talked just loud enough so that he repeated whatever he heard. Durant Simmons, Edenton Bay, shot, dead, drowned. And then, people inside the filling station, they heard it. And so another jitney driver named Buck, he went to him and he said, "What happened? Is that what happened?" And all Colson would say is, "Yes, I guess it's so." So the news spread after that. Buck went to the seafood cafe somewhere down the street. I have no idea where it is. And he spilled the beans. He said, "This has happened. Durant Simmons, he's dead." Now, this was big news because there wasn't much violence in this region. The first man killed in Elizabeth City and in the whole region was killed on early Christmas morning of 1920. Prohibition was almost a year old by then. And they raided a house, and one policeman went around back to intercept the guy if when they burst in the front door, he was going to run out the back, and he did. And he told him to halt. The guy didn't. Instead, he reached, kind of like you see on TV shows, reached to the back, and the policeman thought he was reaching for a gun, so he shot him. That was the first man killed by the law during Prohibition. So when this happens 7 years later, people are really, really upset. So you can imagine, you know how gossip works. You tell it from one person to the next person to the next person. And we're going to see how far this goes. So it then goes to the newspaper. They said, "Hey, call over to Edenton and see what you can find." Then somebody said, "Wait, Durant Simmons' wife has let us know that," we don't know how she let him know, but has let us know that she wants her sister to go to Edenton and check with the sheriff. So the sister got another jitney driver, and they went to Edenton, and the jitney driver talked to the sheriff there, and the sheriff didn't know anything about it. Somebody else says, "Well, wait a second. Agent J.J. London is here. He generally stayed in the area for maybe extended periods. I can't prove how long, but when he stayed at the Southern Hotel right across from this, what I think is the location of the filling station." And so somebody went up to J.J. London and said, "Okay, what happened? Is this what happened?" And he said, "Well, I suppose it's true." So vague answers. Well, then the next step is, we have harbor tours now, harbor tour boats that go from city to city this summer. Anybody been on one? Goes from Edenton to a certain location. Plymouth, Elizabeth City, Hertford, Columbia, Manteo, they're all on the route. Well, a century ago, there were boat companies that went and did something similar, but for other reasons. They often carried mail, or they carried passengers or goods or whatever. And one of those boats was actually at Manteo at the time. It pulled up to the dock there, and somebody said, "Did you hear what happened? Durant Simmons is dead." Well, the next stop for that boat was East Lake. So one of the crewmen on board said, "Well, I know where the family should be." So he was going to head over there. And what did he find? He found Durant Simmons alive and well, butchering a hog. If you're from here and you have long time roots, then you know that it was once the practice of country people who raised hogs to have hog killings the coldest part of the year. So February 2nd was probably a good cold time then, because that was how you could butcher it. The hot temperatures, you wouldn't do it now because it would spoil so quickly. Gave you time to salt the meat and do whatever. So that's what he was doing. So when the boat went back to Elizabeth City, you know what happened? And you see it. It got into the paper. The crew explodes. Wild story of battle in Bay. And notice, killing hogs now. So what happened? And the article said, Durant Simmons, well, he lacked a great deal of being a corpse. I love the little dry humor. So something happened, and we're trying to get to that big boat. Well, imagine this. We're at Edenton, right? That's where everything starts at Edenton Bay. And then it whips around, that gossip whips around all through the area. And then guess what happens that night at Coinjock? Federal agents from Norfolk are waiting there for a vessel coming from East Lake that they know is loaded with liquor. So, was all this smoke and mirrors here, the Durant Simmons fiasco, part of it? I mean, we had Jack Colson, a known moonshiner, and J.J. London, a federal agent, both speaking vaguely. So, guess how much they got on that boat? 2,500 gallons of liquor, and it was the Silver Spray, the boat that is on the cover of my book, and they captured it well after dark, apparently the same night that Durant Simmons was in his watery grave. So, because at this point, we played out Durant Simmons and we know a couple of days later he's alive, but at that point, they didn't know. So people were preoccupied. Now, the thing that was interesting was 6 agents had come down in a car from Norfolk, 3 of them, and they also brought a small boat. So a couple of them got in the boat, and when they went to start the motor, when they saw, here comes the Silver Spray, it sputtered. You know how lawnmowers do and other equipment does, and it just sputters. It sputtered enough that it got the attention of the guy on the boat. He saw, uh-oh, this is what's happening. He did not want to be caught with evidence. There was too much evidence on that boat for him to throw overboard. So he grounded the boat, leaped off, and ran off into the greenery, into the bushes or whatever. So if you go to Coinjock, know that somewhere near that place, a man escaped and managed to avoid arrest there. Well, the federal agents, they knew nothing about boats, but they had a job. A couple of them were going to go back to Norfolk in the car, and 3 of them were going to take the boat to Norfolk. Guess what? I'm not going to tell you everything went wrong, but everything that could go wrong went wrong. And so 24 hours later, with no radio contact, nobody knew where they were, they finally chugged into Norfolk at the foot of City Hall Avenue. So the boat made it. And again, you recognize maybe the book cover, but I wanted to show you. It started at Edenton, Elizabeth City, Matteo, Eastlake, Coinjock, and Norfolk. And that's how we get the story of the big boat. I tend to think that it was all a ploy to distract people. You can think whatever you want to. If you get the book and read it, please let me know if you've got another theory. Now, I want to tell you about one East Lake raid. There were 17 that I could find in newspapers. The first one was in 1922, another in 1923. I think the federal agents actually hired boats from the waterfront to take them there. Can you tell me what happened when they got there? Did they arrest anybody? Were those people taking them over to East Lake somehow connected to East Lake? I happen to think so, because they didn't arrest anybody, and the early stills were small, 60 gallons, something like that. In 1925, the third raid, the federal agents said, we're going to ask the Coast Guard to take us. And there was a Coast Guard wharf here in Elizabeth City near the bridge today that goes to Camden. And there's a little park called Veterans Park. If you go there, that is pretty much the spot where the Coast Guard wharf was. Was there a Coast Guard vessel there? It was there as a supply boat. It carried supplies to the life-saving stations in and around the islands when you go to the real Outer Banks. So that's why it was there. Well, in 1925, the agent said, we need you, and they took them. And they did it again in 1926. This was the gentleman who was the captain of the boat, Captain Charles O. Miller. He lived here. He had a chance on several occasions to carry federal agents over to East Lake. And on this particular raid, the agents arrived, a dozen agents arrived, before it'd be 2 or 3, and they realized, you know, there's a lot going on at East Lake. We really need to clean up. They sent a dozen men to raid East Lake. And they did a few other raids while they were here, but a dozen men, that was a lot of men. Well, the Coast Guard vessel was a little bit over 60 feet long, but it had sleeping quarters for like 2 or 3 people. So this was like several night event. So in between raids and things, they had to sleep wherever they could. So it was not comfortable, but they fed them and they got there. But they left in the early, well, somewhere about midnight. And from here, down there by the bridge, it took them about 3 hours to go up the Pasquotank River, across the Albemarle Sound into the mouth of the river. And there's an island there called Durant Island. And the captain, he anchored there so that it was out of sight of anybody who might be over on shore by Pinner's Wharf or the ferry landing. So he anchored there. And pretty soon after that, the men, the agents, put away the map because guess what? They had an informant. He had been there in November at East Lake. And when he got back home, he noted where all the stills were. And so he had given them this map, the informant. He had been spying for the agents. And so they all got paid somehow. We don't know how. Those kinds of records don't survive. But they had the map. They stowed it again. And then they lowered some boats and they got in the water and they headed out into South Lake first. Well, they found stills, and some of them had just been recently used, but guess what? Was there anybody there? No. Because the good thing about East Lake is it takes a while for people to work their way back up these little narrows to get to where you're coming. I'm sure people heard them long before they got there. And they could evaporate like ghosts into the mist. So nobody was there. But they did get a couple of copper worms. This is a copper worm. It's a big one. They had big ones. They got a couple of copper worms, and they decided, well, when they found a net stake in South Lake, a long stake that people could tie either nets to or maybe use to tie a boat to, they tied one of their boats to it, and they put their 2 worms in there that they'd already gotten, and they reorganized the men, and they continued on their way. They said, we'll just pick these up later because they're cumbersome. Can you see that? That's cumbersome for a small boat, especially if you have several. Well, they went, they got 5 more worms. Good day. They're coming back down the lake. It's a long lake. And they see something unusual. Their boat has been cut. It's no longer tied to that stake. It's just floating there. And guess what else? No copper worms. So somebody, while they were scooting around getting to these other still sites, came behind them, took the worms, which were very valuable because they were copper and they were troublesome to make, and slipped away, and nobody knew where they were. Well, the next day, they went back to the Coast Guard vessel, spent the night, and then the next day they went up Milltail Creek. Guess what they found at Milltail Creek? Nearly nothing. All the still sites that had been marked for them, you could see ghost marks in the ground where there had been equipment, but nothing was there. They had picked everything up, cleaned it up, and took it away. So they got skunked that day. So when they got back on the boat that night, they were going to spend the night, one more uncomfortable night in May on that boat before they headed back to Elizabeth City. Guess what happened? Somebody from shore shot over the bow of the boat. Was it a warning? Was it a taunt? We don't know. So far, they really were in charge. Those ghostly moonshiners, those people in the mist, they were in charge, and the agents were just muddling through doing the best that they could. So the next day, it gets into the paper, and it is Mammoth Dry Raid launched by federal sleuths under cover of darkness. And then look a little bit below that, and it says, may have been leak. Yes. And in fact, somebody came forward and they had witnessed that about 30 minutes before the AB-21, the Coast Guard vessel, finally cast off and was heading down the river, a fast gas boat moored up probably closer to where we are, took off and gently went up the river till it got around a curve. And a fast gas boat could go a lot faster than that big old 60-some foot Coast Guard vessel, because that took them 3 hours. I'm sure the fast gas boat got there in a fraction of the time. So somebody said, oh yes, somebody was there. So those spies I mentioned and those informants, you've seen evidence of that already several times in the story. Well, when they went, the agents had taken with them 31 arrest warrants. It wasn't like a peel off a pad. They had an idea that there were probably at least 31 to arrest. That's a lot, isn't it? Most of the time you got 2, 3, a handful of guys, but they had 31 arrests, And how many guys did they capture? Zero. They did go to 6 sites on South Lake, 7 at Milltail Creek, and all we know is that they got 5 worms. All moonshiners had vanished. They did confiscate 140 of those demijohns and 5 copper worms. I'm going to talk about the worms in a second, but Agent Clifton, one of the dozen agents, attributed or estimated the losses for moonshiners at $15,000 to $20,000 in 1926 money. Okay, guess what? In 2020, that range starts at $186,000, up to several million. I think it was 2 or 3 million. Now, why is there such a variety in those figures? Because if you figure it, you figure just what they destroyed, the equipment, the mash, the bottles, etc. That's one figure. Well, what if you figure the labor cost in it? How many men took time? How many boats did it take to go bring those resources there? And so that raises the price, doesn't it? And then if you say, what was the selling value? Probably close to $2 or $3 million. So that gives you an idea of how lucrative the business was. And I will say this, most of the time when agents raided Elizabeth City, they destroyed thousands of dollars worth of stuff, 10, 15, 20, 35,000. You keep multiplying those numbers, you see they took big hits. But guess what? They never put them out of business. How is that possible? I think they were making a lot of money. So, and that was my last question. Did the moonshiners recover? Absolutely, they did. Well, after the raid, they went back to Elizabeth City, and they're at the Coast Guard dock. And you see some of the buildings, if you walk down there today or sometime, take a look. Those buildings are still there. I think one of the buildings is a loft across the street, and I guess it's apartments or something. But anyhow, they're there, and they're standing proudly with their prizes. You can only see 3 worms here. There were 2 more. And so the agents are arrayed around it. You see to the left, the man in the black uniform, that is Captain Miller. And you see in the distance, a lot of people have come to town to see it. On their way to work, they are standing there looking at what had happened. And so they had the proof. Now, I don't have that picture in here, but the other thing they did is, guess what? They poured the liquor into the river, just like they did from the Silver Spray in Norfolk. So can you imagine people who really wanted a drink just said, oh my gosh, look at that. And of course, the fish weren't too happy. They were not too concerned about the environment at the time. I'm sure it was diluted, but initially it must have been quite painful for the fish. They weren't thinking about that. So the gentleman who's the lead agent, if you look at the fella in the light coat, just to the right of the cabin, and he's got a light coat and his hand is holding a cigarette. That is Agent McDuffie. He was born and raised in Moore County, and he's buried there. But he was the lead agent, and I think at the time he was assigned to the Charlotte office. So he had come in and pulled in agents from here, there, and everywhere to do these jobs in and around Elizabeth City. And they were back with their prizes, the copper worms. Why were copper worms prizes? Well, number one, copper was expensive. And number two, if you were going to make a copper worm for your still, you went to the shores of the Alligator River or the lake where there was white, pretty sand. And there is white, pretty sand there. And you filled the tube up with sand so that when you wound it around a tree you chose, it didn't crimp. Then after you had it all wound up, you cut it, emptied the sand, and you had a worm. So if they took the copper worms, it took a while for them to get the copper and do all that, and it was expensive. So that's why they were prizes. But again, they didn't arrest anybody. And I want to give you an idea of where these agents came from. Closer to the latter years of Prohibition, somebody, an official in the state said, you know what? We needed 10 federal agents in each county. At the time, North Carolina already had 100 counties. They needed 1,000 agents to do the job that needed to be done. Probably it was like that all over the state, but they didn't have them. And you'll see that these guys came from everywhere because there were not that, there was a handful of agents that had to keep going from place to place. And this gentleman, John Horton's from Raleigh, Thomasville, Hillsborough, Durham, Raleigh again, Charlotte, Rocky Mount, that's Agent J.J. London. McDuffie from the Charlotte office at the time. Clifton from Fayetteville. And this other gentleman from Sanford. And you see, they came from all over. And once they were finished, they just went back, packed up, and spread out again, and they went to other places to do raids. But there's only 10 men here. This man is T.W. Snell. He was from Washington County, from Plymouth, which is in our region. So he was a federal agent for a while. And of course, here is a picture of this, and it is on loan to me temporarily from a gentleman who had a property who has a property at East Lake, and when he bought it, this was stowed away in the attic. It is pretty much the size of the big worms we were talking about. It's an 1.5 inches in diameter. That was for a big still, 200, 250 gallons, 300-gallon stills. They made a lot of moonshine. That first man killed in December all those years ago, he had like a 60-gallon little still on a stove in his house. So this was big. And they said smaller stills had smaller tubing, and liquor gushed out of this, but liquor trickled out of those smaller stills. This is Agent J.J. London, as I mentioned, and he stayed in the Southern Hotel. He's on record in the newspaper for being there several different times, and he stayed one time in room 101. You can't get into the Southern Hotel anymore. They tell me that the interior is no longer accessible, but that was an important place for some of the agents, I suspect. East Lake was legendary, and some described their liquor as sterling on silver. You know, everybody didn't use copper tubing. Some used lead. You know, some used materials that would hurt you or kill you. They also were praised for having an astonishing, complete espionage system. Now, you've heard a little bit about spies. There are many more tales of them in there. And some people even said it was comparable to what they had in Washington, D.C.'s Secret Service. And another man who went along on one of the trips, a reporter, he just said this place, he dubbed it Moonshine. He said it was a utopia. You know, there was no crime. People just wanted to make liquor, and they educated their children their way. And, you know, they just fantasized about this place. And the truth is, when they started, remember, we had a depression. The men who started making moonshine, they had the recipes, they had the know-how, but mostly they needed to feed their families. So in the early days, they were just doing what was available for them to do. And then here's a bottle of East Lake rye whiskey that was, you can tell it's been on display here at the museum when they had a moonshine exhibit a couple of years ago. So East Lake rye whiskey was not just some unbottled thing, it was a real thing. People knew about it. There was another writer who became interested in this. His name was Ben Dixon McNeil. If you Google him, he was quite impressive. He was a freelance writer in our state, and he wrote an article after doing extensive research that appeared in papers across the country. And his article was entitled, "The Ghost Makes Good Liquor." And he interviewed people in the Justice Department. I'm sure he interviewed other agents. I feel sure he read some of the newspaper articles, and he looked into it, and he wrote an article. And on August the 2nd of 1931, imagine people in New York City opening the New York Herald Tribune while they're sipping coffee and eating their toast. And there's this article, "The Ghost Makes Good Liquor." Well, people in big cities across the country read about East Lake moonshine that same day. It appeared in a local newspaper a week later, but in any case, it really, I think, starts to show how significant East Lake liquor was. According to the Justice Department, Buffalo City, and remember I told you Buffalo City is kind of representative of East Lake, they produced annually 1.5 million quarts of moonshine. It's a lot of moonshine. Now factor in the liquor that got destroyed, they made even more than that. And it was also said that the Buffalo City distillery grew to perhaps the most extensive distillery in the United States. The death knell came with the Depression. You know, Prohibition began with a depression. Well, it ended the last couple of years with the Big Depression. There were fewer customers because people didn't have that money anymore to spend. And so that meant competition among moonshiners and bootleggers uh, for sales. And then, of course, people started to become violent. Some people, not everybody. In Perquimans County, there was an incident where 3 people died in one long weekend in August. I think it was early August. And it was because a moonshiner at one end of the county and a moonshiner at another end of the county were competitors. The sheriff called one of them in to interrogate him, and he said, that other guy, he told on me. And he was afraid he was going to get called in again. So he sent a hitman out to follow the route his adversary usually took. And he shot him, but he also killed the wife by accident. So, and then guess what happens to the guy who did the killing for him? What happened to him 2 days later? You can guess, right? He was pushing up daisies too. They made sure that he was dead, so he could not tell what happened. Berea Church. Anybody familiar with the Berea Church area north of Elizabeth City? That was really active. I mentioned that several times in the book. Well, there, federal agents went out early in the morning and they crossed about 1.5 miles deep to a place where they knew there was a still. And before it was over, one of them got shot. He was shot in the hip, so he lived. But those moonshiners, because they were making liquor there, they were not taking any chances. At Hog Quarter in Courthouse County, which is a little bit near Powell's Point, if you go to the beach that way, you've probably seen it on the map or anything. By 1931, or 32, federal agents had been having cars for a few years. And what happened was when they went on raids and everybody got out of the car and went to the raid, moonshiners came from behind and decorated their cars. They blasted them with shotgun blasts and damaged them. Well, on this raid, they decided, Mr. X, you stay with the car. We're going to go into this marsh and we're going to take care of that, but you stay here. So the man who picked the short straw, he sat in the vehicle for a while. He got out, he walked around, he got back in, and all of a sudden, kabam, something came through the cab. Shocked, he got out and he grabbed his hat. And as he was getting ready to put his hat on his head, he saw daylight through his hat. It had narrowly missed hitting him, probably killing him. And so that is an illustration that there was violence. And then finally, the real death knell came when FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was campaigning for president. He had 2 platforms, one with the economy. People were desperate for the economy. And then the other one was, let's repeal prohibition. And they did. But the local estimate is important because officials in the area, they estimated that only 10% of the moonshine produced in this region was ever intercepted by agents. Can you imagine that? I mean, they knew it. They knew they were just bleeding liquor through whatever passageway they could go. And remember, people wanted to drink. At the beginning of Prohibition, they still wanted to drink. Guess what they did? National figures for 1931 from a report called the Wickersham Report said annually Americans were spending $2,845,000,000 a year on alcoholic beverages. So I think that tells you how the dries and how the wets stacked up. And of course, Prohibition was repealed in 1933 in December. So they had almost a full 13-year dose of Prohibition. These are some of my end notes. You'll see in the book, there's tons of newspaper articles there, and I'll be glad to take questions.
They were still, moonshine still, I don't know about now, but moonshine was still being made in Edenton in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s because people just like to have it.
They did. Prohibition ended, and that was where they were trying to stop it completely. They went after 33 to an ABC store system. And the bottom line is the government wanted tax money for it. And so people still made moonshine. And if they didn't get caught, then it was okay. But I know from family experiences that if the revenuer, that's what they tended to call him then, came by, if you gave him $5, he would go away. So yes, it's human nature, isn't it? They're still going to make it. They still want it. They're still going to risk it. And that's pretty much what continued to happen. Any other questions?
More recent,
Uh-huh.
I was taking flying lessons outside of Roanoke, Virginia, and what they said to me. So my lessons were on Sunday morning, Saturday morning, so school the rest of the time. That I had to watch where I went and look for the smoke because it stay away from that area because that's where the moonshiners were.
Yeah.
And they would shoot at planes coming over because that's where the revenue was.
Yeah, exactly. And smoke was a telltale sign. I didn't mention that, but if there was a fire heating a still, you could look across and say, okay, there's something going on there, something going on there, especially when they went to East Lake and see multiple fire columns, smoke columns. So yeah, that was common.
Does it still happen? Are there still problems?
I don't know. I think we're kind of past that. I think drugs have overtaken that so much, but I don't know. I'm just talking now. I have no idea. Any other questions? I thank you then. I invite you if you want to come look at a few things. I will point out that that milk bottle was representative for the judge who used to get his liquor that way. And this little box is not in the book, but my husband made it for me. They had a thing called a Moonshine bookshelf. And I'm going to take the bottle off of it right now. But if you want to, you can push it open and you'll see why it's a Moonshine bookshelf. Thank you so much. I appreciate your attention.